So, bonsoir et bienvenue au lancement de The Smallest Objective de Sharon Kirsch. Sharon Kirsch is a travel writer, she's a blogger, and she's also written 2 books of nonfiction. Her first, What Species of Creatures, chronicles early settlers in the New World and the beasts that they encountered. And her new book we're celebrating tonight is The Smallest Objective. Now, this is a personal memoir. She writes about her mother's decline into dementia, her mother's move to an assisted care facility, and what Sharon finds as she cleans out the family home for sale. In The Smallest Objective, she digs, sometimes literally, and researches endlessly every small object that could shed light on her family's past. And in so doing, she illuminates the lives of several generations of Jewish Montrealers and the life of the city they came to, which is Montreal, where I am tonight. So I'm very pleased to welcome Sharon Kirsch. Thanks. Hello, Sharon.
Hello, Jeanette. Thank you so much.
We're in Jewish Montreal. We're talking about 3 generations of your family, 3 generations of Montrealers. The Smallest Objective investigates traces of past lives in objects hidden in the basement of your family home. Sharon, when did you decide to write about your mother's decline and what you were finding as you cleaned up her house for the sale?
The story really began with a request or a directive from my father. Before he died, he told me and my mother that he had buried a treasure underneath the bedroom carpet of the family home, and that if we were going to sell the house, we absolutely must retrieve this treasure. Now, that proved far more difficult than I had imagined. My father had instructed me to get a metal detector, and I did all the basics without any success, and eventually had to recruit some archaeologist friends and carpenter friends to assist me. And I'm not going to say what actually happened, but I will say that I found many treasures in the house of various kinds. There were the ordinary sort of things people find in their parents' homes, and you yourself have been through this experience recently, I believe, the letters, the diaries, the old photo albums, the vintage clothing. As more specific to my family were some natural history and science objects. So there was my grandfather's microscope, which we'll be discussing, some lantern slides, and I can actually show what those look like. Those were slides, in his case, of plant cells, and they are illustrated here in the book. And I also found many specimens of rocks and sand, minerals, things that both my parents and my grandparents collected.
Tell me, where did you discover that microscope?
I found the microscope in the basement in my parents' house on some shelves, and I don't believe I'd ever seen it before. I am actually going to show it to everybody briefly. I'm going to lift it up. It's very heavy, in fact. And so I hope everybody can see it well here. You see, it's called a jug handle, very obviously because of the type of handle. And the objectives I've been referring to are these lenses here. Now, the smallest objective is not actually any smaller to look at than the others, but it is a lens of a different type. And so that is a microscope, very happily celebrating its centenary as the book has come out. So that's a particularly nice little flourish.
Let's talk about Jockey Fleming.
Yes.
So are you going to do a bit of a reading about him, which would illustrate who he was, and would you like to introduce that?
Yes, sure. Jockey, as I said earlier, was a ticket tout, somebody who sold tickets for the hockey games and the Blue Bonnets racetrack at an inflated price. He was somebody who sold information in sealed envelopes, apparently. So he knew everybody in town and they knew him. And he was really, to some extent, the creation of journalists, although he also supplied them with a great deal of material. I think one of the interesting things about Jockey for me was that I was the first person to write about him, and I'm certainly in a very large company of people who did write about him, but I am the first, as far as I'm aware, who actually knew anything about his family background. It was rumored that he came from New Jersey, which was not at all true, and he was quite content to allow these stories to circulate about him without ever verifying their truth. My great uncle confounded some of the best newspapermen of the post-war era, the sports writers Jim Coleman and Dink Carroll, gossip columnists Fitz and Al Palmer, and humorist Don Bell. Whether by design or by accident, Jockey lived as a man without personal history. Left to describe his own lineage, he cited as distant and unknowing ancestors One-Eyed Connolly from Massachusetts and Pitsy Blackman from Cincinnati, both expert gatecrashers. In an homage to their example, Jockey reportedly gatecrashed Madison Square Garden by masquerading as a peanut vendor in a barber's white coat. My mother's uncle thus allowed to his chroniclers no more than spoofs, one-liners, carefully curated stories, and hearsay. Jockey's escapades, whether told by him or his fleet of newspapermen, often have him coming out on top. But there's another strain in the literature of Jockey, the occasional ridiculing of him by his own admirers, and as an element of his repartee, a belittling of himself. As early as 1921, my mother's uncle recited How I Became a Bum, his autobiography in brief, for a benefit at the Gaiety Theatre. Jockey soon after befriended Eddie Cantor, Mickey Rooney, and Al Jolson, all great guys, he said, and most are on top today, but the old jock is still at the corner of Peel and St. Catherine shoving his 2 hockey tickets. My grandfather, Jockey's brother, continually lamented that the family had no luck. Moses Rutenberg was born in the 1890s, Maurice, my grandfather, at the turn of the century. But Moses, not Maurice, became the innovator. It's he who deserves credit for self-determination. His inventiveness came from within, from his natural leanings, and from without, from the city he inhabited. In particular, Montreal in the war years allowed Moses Rutenberg to fulfill the promise of Jockey Fleming. As elsewhere, in Montreal, the anxiety of war fostered revelry. Already a source of illicit gambling and cheap whiskey in the 20s and 30s, Montreal in the mid-40s hosted some 200 gambling dens, plus nightclubs and blind pigs. At the Samovar, the El Morocco, and the TikTok Club, hustlers like Moses Rutenberg dodged Apache dancers and knife throwers. Nearby, in the Chez Wen room, the newspaperman Dick Carroll, among the several literary endorsers of Jockey Fleming, drank in the lounge owned by the 2 prize fighters, Slitkins and Slotkins. Late nights ended at Ben's Delicatessen, garlic sausage only 10 cents, the breath of a nation. This was Freddie the Count's Montreal, Hickey the Lightman's, Oscar the Hammer's. Alongside Charlie the Horse, Jockey Fleming added to his already considerable reputation in a city open for business.
Just brings up so many reflections and memories of, I'm sure, a lot of people who are listening as well. I think we have time now for questions from our audience. David Bernardi says, thank you, I enjoyed the music. Molly Peacock says, so glad to be here, Sharon. Shelley Klein says, Sharon, please tell us a bit about your aunt, one of the moving parts of the memoir. Did you know her story beforehand?
Thank you, Shelley, for that question. And thank you, Molly and Dave, for your comments. I didn't know a great deal about Carol. My mother didn't really talk about her. It was a very awkward area of conversation. Whenever we passed Green Avenue in Montreal, which is a corner some of you will know, my mother will say that's where my sister collapsed. But it didn't go much beyond that. And I think also, even as a child, I sensed it was a very difficult topic and I didn't pry, I didn't ask further questions, which I now regret.
We have another question from Paolo Nohouse.
Yes.
Sharon, have any other relatives, cousins, or for instance, interested in your family history and contributing to that research?
I think I do. There are some people, some of whom I don't even especially know, but I've heard about more distant cousins or relatives who have been doing some family trees, and I probably could find some of that now on Ancestry. But I have also had the pleasure through this book of making contact or resuming contact with some of my extended family, both in Montreal and elsewhere, including a cousin in Australia. And so we've all been exchanging photographs and stories. But as far as I'm aware, I am the only person to have written anything for publication about the family.
Maria Mendel asks another question. Did this research and discovery process give you any ideas for future projects? She says she wants to read more.
Oh, that's nice. Well, I did actually travel to Lithuania shortly after my mother died, and I wrote a whole chapter about my experience in Lithuania, which my publisher and I decided didn't actually belong in the book. So I have that material, and that is something I would certainly like to do more with. I would love to make another trip to Lithuania and perhaps be able to write something more expansive.
And I was wondering, is your family story, do you think, typical of many of the stories of Jewish Montrealers?
Probably yes and no. I think that certainly the hardships of immigration would be typical. My family came over relatively early for that really large wave of Eastern European immigration. There were some Jews who came over much earlier, at the time the British, but afterwards the huge immigration of Eastern European Jews was really in the first decade of the 20th century, from about 1900 to 1910. My relatives came over somewhat earlier than that, in the 1880s. So that aspect was not so typical. I think moving down to a more particular level, I think Jockey Fleming, for instance, was not especially typical. It was not unusual for Jews to be entertainers, but I think it was less usual, apparently, from my reading, for them to be criminals or near criminals. And so he was obviously a rather unusual personality. And then, of course, there are always the specifics of the family. My Aunt Carol's tragic death at such a
Yes.
young age is thankfully not something that would be characteristic of most people's experience either.
Well, it's a delightful read. Thanks so much, Sharon.
Thank you, Jeanette.
I quite enjoyed visiting with you tonight.
Yes, likewise. Thank you for being with me.
I think Josh Dolgin is going to stick around and play us out. So all the best to you, and I'll keep in touch for future.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for your help and making it such a nice evening for everybody.
Mazel tov, Sharon.
Thank you, Socalled, for your contribution.
Bravo.
Wonderful. Thank you.